For a long time, I didn't know if I should even tell anyone. A lot of people wouldn't believe me, or thought I was an idiot. But when my great-grandfather told me everything, I cried. I was afraid. I felt close to a pre-infarction state. I believed him, but whether they would believe me if I wanted to tell someone, such a story is another matter. And he told his story to me with one foot in the grave, lying in bed, inhaling the last oxygen of his life. His name was Arkady, my great-grandfather. I knew him well, and, well, there was something about him I couldn't explain. A handsome but broken watch. He had no sparkle in his eyes. A hard fate, wouldn't you say? Worse. Hell. And my great-grandfather told me about 1933. How field mice and worms were a delicacy in summer, and a piece of bread was a luxury. How ratting, concealment, and betrayal became commonplace. It was a hard time both physically and psychologically. At first, they thought they would starve to death, but they survived. But something in their brains was stuck forever. I knew that the cause of grandfather's torment, somewhere among those memories, but I did not dare to press him. But my curiosity was piqued, and Grandpa understood that. Here's what he told me. In March 1933, to them in the village Whirlwind, flew a rumor that 15 kilometers from the old warehouse, in the ravine built and carefully camouflaged a small hut. And in it there was, judging by this rumor, salvation with a capital and golden letter, grain, potatoes, carrots, nuts, beans, apples, and other products that could save from the terrible famine. One problem was the weather. Everything must have gone bad by now, after the winter, if it had. And no one wanted to go on an empty stomach for no clear reason. So Arkady went. He left his wife at home, and there was nothing left for him to do. His two sons, Semyon and Rostislav, that is, my grandfathers, were barely breathing. It was hard for them. They were just children, and while Arkady was away, and he hadn't been home for 4 days, Rostislav's mother had time to bury him the day after her husband left. The kid couldn't take it. They didn't tell Syomka about his brother's death. Mom lied that she let Rostik go for a walk. For a long time, those who were still adequate helped to bury him. In general, not everyone was buried at that time. Sometimes families died, and there were no friends left to bury them. And if earlier the only thing that saved us from the terrible stench was the fact that it was winter, now things were taking a bad turn. The living were becoming fewer and fewer every day. The houses were scared away by the grim presence of death. The candles in the houses burned for 2 days, and everyone already knew that the whole family had fallen asleep on the unheated stoves. And the stench of the stink would soon seep out and walk on the olfactory receptors of the living. And then, Alkasha left, and my son was gone. My great-grandmother went completely mad. By the way, the village didn't know where her husband had gone. They thought he was dead too, and then he came back, all gray, barely standing on his feet, staggering. Not a man, a shadow, and 2 sacks in his hands. Everyone who could still walk in the village cried with happiness that night. Arkady dutifully divided the groats for 47 people. It seemed from the outside that people were having a holiday. Each received an impressive handful. And then, great. Grandfather learned, right on the street, that his son, Rostik, was buried, and he fell to the ground like a hamstring. What do you mean? Buried? His wife explained in a rambling and painfully sad tone that, on the day after his departure, she saw her son off to the next world. How could it be? He looked at his fellow villagers and his wife with eyes full of horror. He followed me all the way. He helped me carry the sacks. And just before the road to the village, he told me that he would go the other way. I didn't know. And he sobbed. Loudly, tearfully. At this point in the story, I remember quietly crying too. But my great-grandfather wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the wall and nonchalantly recounted his memories. And the villagers, of course, were not very eager to believe Arkasha. It is not customary to walk dead. Although one thing was alarming, he really couldn't carry the sacks alone. Not Hercules. Thanks to the grits, we lived freely for a week and a half. We ate a little bit of everything. We tried not to be greedy, and they were afraid to die because their stomachs often stopped perceiving food as such. And when they ate too much, people suffered even more, and then they'd die. Grandfather Arkady put up with it. He ate little, but he still ate. He lived. And then Semyon began to complain that Rostik was keeping him awake. He walks around the room at night, sniffing loudly. And does not talk. Semyon told Mom and Dad. And he was very surprised when Dad's hair stood on end. He started laughing and said that Papa's head was a broom. He laughed, standing next to Papa. Meanwhile, Arkady was looking just above his son's shoulder, into the corner. At the grim, to the point of losing his pulse, familiar silhouette. Small milk teeth peeking out from under pale lips. A slightly frowning forehead and closed eyes. And worst of all, he could see the pupils moving quickly and rapidly under those pale eyelids. And then Semyon stopped laughing, broke away abruptly, and ran out of the house. Where he ran to, he never realized. Arkady stood and, as mesmerized, looked at his son, who by definition could not be there. This nonsense dug so painfully into his brain that it made his eyes dark. It inspired fear, primal and unbridled, in such a way that there was nothing left in his body but that very fear, a complete stupor, the inability of the brain cells to function, and as if the soul was leaving the body because it no longer obeyed. Great. Grandfather had experienced it firsthand, and it was a wild scream that brought him out of his stiffness. When he blinked and looked again at the corner, there was only emptiness, the junction of two walls, a layer of dust on the floor, and 2 footprints in the dust. One single piece of evidence that the vision was real. I wish there hadn't been footprints. I wish the son were gone. If he's dead, let him go. He never left. And when the grandfather ran out into the street, to the scream, then before him, such a picture opened that he was ready to howl with horror. Right on the road, in the center, not moving, lay his Seema, around a crowd of people about something indignant bickering, and his mother, terrified eyes bulging, stood over the body of his son, standing there like an executioner, and in her hands she held a metal stick. Semyon died instantly. The blow came to the temporal region and simply crushed the soft tissue. That was the moment when tears rolled down my cheeks for the second time. I hastily wiped them away, noting at the same time that my hands were all goose flesh. It was a nightmare story. I was getting more and more interested. But at the same time, something told me that my great-grandfather's next words would shock me even more. And I was damn right in my premonition. He had buried his second son with his own hands. Even the word hysteria doesn't convey the full range of emotions Arkady experienced. He buried him next to Rostislav's grave, and then sat all evening and all night near these 2 graves. Rustic. What about you? It was you. Our mom couldn't do such a thing. He sat there repeating those words. And then he heard the words back. I don't like Semyon." Arkady looked around. The dusk obstructed his vision, but there was definitely no one around. The words sounded quietly and as if out of nowhere. For what sins he had to suffer, my great-grandfather did not know. Nor did he know what sins his son was being tortured for. Dead but disturbed. What was wrong? What did Rostik want? For even if he simply disliked his younger brother, he would have fulfilled his mission in this world and calmed down. But he didn't stop visiting Arkady. He came every week, and grandfather got used to it. Because, despite the fact that Rostislav was dead, he was constantly helping his father and mother. He sat quietly and hummed children's songs, as if he'd never died. His mother saw Rostik too, but she denied him as a son. He was a stranger. No longer her son. Something ugly, creepy, otherworldly. She would directly ask Rostik what he wanted, why he would not rest in peace, and the boy would shrug his shoulders. And so the years passed, and the famine passed. My great-grandfather and my great-grandmother survived that nightmare. There were about a dozen of them left in the village, and salvation came for them. Army officers passed by. They didn't even realize that somewhere among the corpse vapors there was still life, and they saw the living, and they took them all. They moved them into town and gave them one of the empty houses to live in temporarily. Life was getting better, except that Rostik came again. Despite the fact that great-grandfather had already gotten used to the company of his dead son, he noticed something very interesting one cloudy day. Rostislav was growing up, not as noticeably as people grow up, but his body proportions were changing. His facial features were becoming coarse. Boy, teenager, young man, and then, a couple more years later, something quite unnatural happened. Arkady, coming home from work, heard crying. A baby crying. He went into the room and saw his slightly greenish wife holding a pile of dirty rags in her arms, with Rostislav standing next to her and smiling. Such a vile smile on his face Arkady had never seen before. He came closer and saw in this dirty laundry a baby, a perfectly healthy baby. What kind of baby is that? It was a good question. The question was meant for Rostik. It's your grandson. That's not my grandson, you son of a bitch. Go away, go away. I am now. I'll go now. There's nothing to keep me here anymore. Raise him, my Sasha. At this point, grandfather stopped talking and looked at me. I was already digesting the information. It all sounded too wild, and then it came to me. I'm Igor Alexandrovich. Alexandrovich, you understand? I slowly got up from the chair. I couldn't even feel my legs. I was hit on the head with something heavy, so much so that I was ready to faint. I asked my great-grandfather if my father knew that his father, that is, my grandfather, brought him from nowhere, being already dead, and my grandfather gave me a short and affirmative nod. I raised him as my grandson, as Rostislav asked. You may not believe me, but with these words, Arkady reached under his pillow and pulled out a small photograph, darkened by time. There were 4 people on it, Arkady and his wife, my little dad, and another man whose facial features were remarkably similar to my dad's now. On the back, the year was 1963. I cried for the 3rd time. I don't know why. I myself don't fully understand what's real and what's not in this story, but my great-grandfather told it so convincingly that I didn't doubt his words for a second. And then my dad came into our room, Alexander Rostislavovich. He smiled at first, asked why my face was swollen, and then I watched the smile disappear from his lips in a hurry. Dad was looking directly at the picture in my hands. "You mean you already know?" Dad looked alternately at me and his grandfather. I couldn't answer. My voice was just gone, and I didn't sleep for 3 nights. It was a shock to me. You don't scare the hell out of people at night, and you don't joke about it. And soon, our Katie died. The funeral took place in a very depressing atmosphere. No, you don't understand. It wasn't just like a funeral. There was something wrong with the funeral. There was something wrong with the funeral. There were no tears, no tantrums, just silence. Not even a whisper. Or maybe I was deaf by then. Only one fact kept me awake afterwards. When I looked again at the photograph given to me by my grandfather, there were 5 faces. Who was the female face that appeared years later?